Hello, nice to see you again. My name is Joanna. If you're new here, we're going to be talking about the books I read in the month of March, and here's a major hint as to which author I read, or at least two authors I read. So I'm going to go ahead and show the books here on the screen before we get started. Starting off with the first Wolf, which is Urth of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. Now I'm going to say what many have said before me, which is that you cannot be complete in your reading experience of Book of the New Sun with that tetralogy if you have not additionally read Urth of the New Sun. It not only clarifies much of what Wolfe was doing in that 4-book series, but it extends the story and, in my opinion, brings it to some sense of a satisfying completion, sense of fruition. It did for me. And this is the surprising thing, is that I feel much, much more satisfied finishing this book than I did with Citadel of the Autarch, which is odd to say. And obviously I can't get into spoilers here, but I will say that this is a series that plays with time and memory in a broad way, in an interesting way. We are in first-person narration with a torturer named Severian. He starts out being raised in a torturer's guild with a very sadistic upbringing. He claims to have a perfect, infallible memory, and the future looks odd. It's an odd place to be as the sun is dying, and a lot of strangeness ensues. It is quite surreal. It feels eccentric, off-kilter in a lot of ways, and at the same time disjointed. And yet there is a strange cohesion that underlies the whole thing that you start to understand as you read on. And it's masterful in the way that it does it. I think it's actually pretty incredible what Gene Wolfe accomplishes in this series, and at the same time, I do not recommend it widely. I feel like if you're a character-first type of reader, you might struggle with some of the flat characters in this. I feel like some of the characters are fairly flat. This is obviously taking inspiration from Jack Vance's Dying Earth, in which case the characters are also fairly flat, and Severian himself might have other layers of complexity that you start to learn about as you go on, but at the same time, he is horrible to women, and that is something that can be incredibly unsettling when you read this series. I have more to say about that, which I will save for another discussion, and also the fact that this is not the most emotionally moving series. It didn't pull at my heartstrings. I didn't feel that emotionally invested in what was happening, though I was fascinated by it, and I appreciate the scope of what we're dealing with, the ambition of the work, the uniqueness of this series, the fact that I've never read anything like it. I probably never will again. Another thing I'll say, spoiler-free, is that this installment, Urth of the New Sun, to me felt like a bit of a departure at the beginning. It felt like Gene Wolfe's version of a noir crime novel at the beginning, and then it gets back into the swing of things again. I was engaged with all the moral questions that were presented and the themes explored, but it wasn't until the second half that I felt much, much more invested in what was happening. I like how this book brought forth some of the themes from the previous 4 books and explored them in a slightly different way, or brought them out in a different way. So positives for me include the rich, layered storytelling, being very cryptic and thought through from the very beginning of Book of the New Sun all the way to the end of Urth of the New Sun. Quite an ambitious series with such a large scope of what you're dealing with once you realize what you're dealing with. Now, I know there are other books in this world, in this universe, and as I've said before, I'm probably not going to read further. I feel pretty satisfied with where this one ended. And that is not a negative from me, by the way. There are several series where I've felt satisfied with the final book and didn't feel like I needed to read every book in the extended universe. I might try out a different Gene Wolfe book, though, in the future that's not related to this series. I know some people have mentioned to me Soldier of the Mist, if I have that title right. So that one I'm kind of interested in. I have a lot more to say about the series, but I'm going to save my thoughts for the discussion I'm going to be having with Philip, Brian, Jimmy, and Jake from Nerd Level Rising. And speaking of Jake and I buddy read this series together. We buddy read this book with 2 chapters a day, and that was such a fantastic experience. I am convinced I enjoyed this book so much more because of that buddy read. So those are my thoughts for now. So much more to say, but I'll leave it there for now. I know this doesn't look as wolfy, but we're going to go with it because we have another Wolfe book to talk about, and that is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This was my first Virginia Woolf novel. This was written in 1925. I didn't know what to expect reading this book, except that I knew it was written in a stream of consciousness style that Virginia Woolf is known for, and that was part of the movement of the time, the modernist movement, along with authors such as Dorothy Richardson and James Joyce. And this device, from what I understand, is used to blur the lines between character interiority and external surroundings. And it's done to perfection in this book. So you're going to be head hopping between different characters, experiencing their memories, their sense of vulnerability, their emotions, and suddenly look to the sky where there's a plane writing letters and then a taxi going by. And this is symbolizing different things to different characters. And I read this with my mother. We took turns reading this aloud to each other. And I found that whenever I was reading this, I felt this momentum with the prose where I wanted to keep reading and reading and reading and going, but I'd have to force myself to stop sometimes and process what Woolf was trying to say, what she was trying to depict with the subtext and the symbolism. For example, a bubbling fountain in the middle of a park and what that was symbolizing to the characters in that moment. It had such a vibrancy, such a flow to it. My mother used the word scintillating. That was the way she described the prose. And while there's this organic flow with the prose, you might miss it, but there is almost a hidden structure to this book. This book is set over a day in London. It starts in the morning with Clarissa going to get flowers for her party. It ends in the evening with her party. And yet everything is perfectly structured so that Big Ben strikes right at the halfway point of the book. And there's also a symmetry to the themes of the book, the themes being that of life and death. Those were the themes as I understood them. Clarissa has a love of life. This is part of why she wants to have this party. She's not a perfect person, by the way. No character in this book is. She's a bit superficial and rigid at times, described as cold by a certain character, but she does want to have this party. She does love life. And yet there are these haunting passages now and then that almost foreshadow Virginia Woolf's own suicide. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside looking on. She had a perpetual sense as she watched the taxi cabs of being out, far out to sea and alone. She always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. As there is all this anticipation and excitement for this party in the evening, there's also this quiet, haunting feeling about death that's lurking. And I think it's depicted in that quote. And it's also this idea of what we're living for. I think part of life is wanting to anticipate something or wanting to look forward to something. And in this case, it's a party to look forward to at the end of the day, or people that you haven't seen in a long time. And additionally, this important element of death in the story, I think, is depicted through another character, Septimus Warren Smith, who deals with what they called back then shell shock, which we now understand as PTSD. He is somebody who's struggling with the sense of that darkness, of that sense of death around him. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate. People feeling the impossibility of reaching the center, which mystically evaded them. Closeness drew apart. Rapture faded. One was alone. There was an embrace in death. There are other characters in this story, and the other characters, they seem to have important relevance to who Clarissa is as a person, and they bring forth memories of her past, who she was back then compared to who she is now. Same with each of the characters. Each of the characters has a certain identity of who they were in the past versus who they are in the present. But there's also this idea about identity itself, as Clarissa is Mrs. Richard Dalloway. She had the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown. There being no more marrying, no more having of children now, but only this astonishing and rather solemn progress with the rest of them up Bond Street. This being Mrs. Dalloway, not even Clarissa anymore, this being Mrs. Richard Dalloway. Who is Clarissa Dalloway? Why is she special to the people around her? How do they see her? How does she see herself? How is that affected by her age and her marital status? So you could sense there's a bit of a feminist exploration there, but also this deep sense of loneliness, this fear of growing old. And I think it's also somewhat about how a person like this can still be loved despite her flaws. I love how this book doesn't try to hide how messy life is. And at the same time, it doesn't feel heavy-handed. There is a light touch to it, even though it does carry some weight in terms of what it's exploring. English imperialism is on the periphery, so it's also tying in some political themes into this already layered narrative. So there's complexity to it, but it didn't feel weighed down. The chiaroscuro of the story, the dark and the light, balanced each other quite well, but it felt to me still somehow more lively, more life-focused than it did death-focused, if that makes sense. That is my experience with Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells is a classic of science fiction. This was first published in 1897. We are following a scientist named Griffin. He has discovered a method to create invisibility, but with him as a subject, he is struggling to survive without the anecdote, and horror ensues. In fantasy, we see invisibility sometimes with a ring or invisibility cloak. We see that used as a convenience, as something that's advantageous to the character, at least when you can put it on and take it off. I know with the One Ring, it does become more perilous over time, but at least initially, it's advantageous. What I appreciated about The Invisible Man is that, as far as I could tell, there were no plot conveniences, and it was so well thought out. So this invisible man, Griffin, is trying to survive in the English countryside during the winter. I think part of the issue for him is he's not a very good person. He's somebody who is obsessed with science. He's somebody who puts science above people. And he's trying to hide. He's trying to hide his invisibility. I think there's some irony in that, trying to hide your invisibility. And so in order to hide his invisibility, he has to go around naked and barefoot. He struggles to find shelter as an invisible man because how do you do that? You have to sneak into a place without being heard, without being felt, without making a sound. So that's a real struggle. And then additionally, what good is money? If you're completely invisible, how do you use it if you're trying to be completely invisible? So at the beginning of the book, we're introduced to him coming into an inn. He's in heavy clothing and his face is completely wrapped up in bandages. He has an artificial nose. He has goggles. He has himself completely wrapped up, pretending to have a health ailment. And this is an immediately challenging act to keep up. The book has a bit of a darker tone to it, especially given what a rough around the edges person Griffin is. He's short-tempered, he's vengeful, he is quite the force to be reckoned with, especially when he's invisible. But at the same time, I found myself laughing aloud several times throughout this book. I love the humor to it, and especially the description of the clothes at times, like without going into spoilers. It reminded me so much of when I was a child, and when my brother and I would go through department stores at the mall, he would grab clothing and he would beat me up with it and give it voices.
I don't like you.
I don't like you either. It reminded me so much of that time that it just tickled me. So I appreciated the book because of that, and also how well thought through this was. I think I might have even enjoyed it a bit more than The Time Machine, which is crazy because one, I love time travel, and two, The Time Machine is a very strong allegory with social commentary. I don't think this book is quite as strong in its themes. Now, the back of my Penguin edition here says that The Invisible Man is a riveting exploration of science's power to corrupt. I could see that angle to the story, and at the same time, I don't know that I necessarily would derive that theme from the story. I just see Griffin as a rough person to begin with, and like I said, yes, he definitely puts science over people, but I don't know that I could say that science corrupted him as much as I could say that he was a corrupt person. This edition also has a foreword by Christopher Priest, and it does have the parenthetical statement at the beginning that it makes plot details explicit. We love it when introductions do that. I don't know that I've ever been drawn towards being invisible, but I definitely don't ever want to be invisible after reading this book. The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector is a stream of consciousness story that is very short. This is told in first-person narration by a writer named Rodrigo. He is obsessively observing this young girl, this 19-year-old girl, Macabea, who lives in the slums of Rio de Janeiro. She is making ends meet as a typist, but she's also described as an incompetent typist who can barely spell and is kept around on the job basically out of pity. This was also written shortly before Clarice Lispector's own death, and I feel like there's much to be said about the worthiness of this person, this character. This person who might go otherwise completely ignored by society. But there's also a meta element to this story revealed through a certain passage. The narrator brings up the fact that what does it say about himself that he is somebody who is in a more privileged position, obsessed with this girl, and what does it say about you as the reader that you're fascinated by this person as well? She seems to have a positive disposition given the fact she doesn't question anything. She lives her life in ignorance. It's basically taking that old cliche saying, ignorance is bliss, and scrutinizing it. And so it happens that she had no consciousness of herself and didn't complain at all. She even thought she was happy. She wasn't an idiot, but she had a pure happiness of idiots. Interesting considering how often we associate intelligence with being critical, and yet this is somebody who doesn't scrutinize her life. She doesn't question things. She seems to be free and happy as a result of not questioning these things. And it's also deeply existential. She clung to a thread of consciousness and mentally repeated over and over, I am, I am, I am. Who she was, she didn't know. So it's not only her ignorance of life, but her ignorance of self that allows her to survive in the world and almost thrive in her own mindset. She doesn't realize how she's being mistreated by others, how other people are crossing boundaries that she doesn't even think to have. Those existential passages also take me to the dedication at the beginning by Clarice Lispector. She dedicates the book to several classical composers I'm familiar with, such as the Schumanns, both Clara Schumann and Robert Schumann, all those prophets of the present who have foretold me to myself until the instant I exploded into I. There are also alternate titles on the title page, which I'm just going to go ahead and show without reading them all. But she talks about the right to scream, and she doesn't know how to scream. And for me, this book felt like a scream. It felt like it was constantly prodding at you as a reader. It felt aggressive. It felt angry and unsettling and sardonic. There was something poetic about it with the way it was written, with the stream of consciousness writing. A writing style that won't work for everyone. This is definitely not a story I would widely recommend, but it has its own unique appeal to it. It has something to say, even though she says it's a story that can't be finished, that demands an answer, but it's not finished. Metallic Love by Tanith is the sequel to The Silver Metal Lover, and if you watched my Top 10 Books of 2025 video, you will know that I loved The Silver Metal Lover, and it was a huge surprise for me. Not the type of book I gravitate towards typically, but I loved it. And before I tell you why Metallic Love, the sequel, flopped for me, I will first give you a synopsis of what we're dealing with. So in The Silver Metal Lover, we are in first-person narration from a character named Jane. Now, Jane is writing out the story. That's something that I have failed to say in every time I've talked about this book. But she is writing out this book that is her experience meeting a metallic robot named Silver, of all things, a minstrel robot who she falls in love with. And this is set in the future. Jane is a privileged young girl who has a very controlling mother. At this time, robots are threatening to take over jobs, take over the arts, take over lovers. And this was written in 1981, so keep that in mind as it seems very relevant to conversations we're having today. It was so imaginative, engrossing. It just got better and better as it went along, in my opinion. What I loved about The Silver Metal Lover, in addition to this exploration of what it means to be human versus robot, what I loved about it is the way that this relationship grew between the two characters. The way that Jane was pretty insufferable at the beginning of the book, and the way she developed as a character, and the way she was influenced by Silver, and then the way she in turn influenced Silver, the way that they grew together, the direction the story went, which I didn't expect. I thought it was so well done. Tanith is gifted when it comes to gorgeous descriptions of setting. She has a unique, gifted writing style, and I just felt enchanted with this tale. I loved it. It didn't push the boundary, so to speak, in the science fiction genre, nothing like that, but it was still just a wonderful, enchanting, beautifully told story, wonderful chemistry between the two characters, and yet Metallic Love, like I said, completely flopped for me. This is taking place at least 15 years later. It might be more years. I can't remember exactly how many years later. And we're in first person narration in the writing of a different character, a girl named Lauren, who very much contrasts Jane. Whereas Jane was very privileged and spoiled at the beginning of The Silver Medal Lover, Lauren is living in poor circumstances. She's living in a foster home that seems somewhat like a religious cult. And eventually she ends up running away and getting this shady maid job. And then eventually becomes hired by the Meta Corporation, the corporation that makes these robots, and interacting with Silver, or a new version of Silver who calls himself Verilus and has all of Silver's memories. The thing about this book is that I don't know if it was trying to be a romance book or if it was trying to be some sort of interesting, weird science fiction book. But either way, both sides of that just completely failed for me as a reader. I think part of the problem when it came to this attempting to be a romance is that Lauren as a character was so flimsy. I felt like she became even more and more flimsy as the book went on. And I feel like part of that was this idea of like, oh, I'm used to the streets and how it is, but it felt like she didn't really do anything. And I don't always need characters to have agency to enjoy them. I learned that with Baker, among other authors. I can enjoy a book where a character has no agency and can still be interesting. This character just didn't seem very interesting to me and became less interesting as the book went on, and she was constantly judgmental of other people, being more shallow and superficial and selfish, but she never did anything. And then Verilus, this new version of Silver, also lost all his charm compared to the first book. So from a romance standpoint, it completely failed. The characters were just so lackluster, became more unlikable as the story went on for me. And there was no build-up, there was no development that was meaningful in any way. And then from a science fiction standpoint, this whole conversation about robots, that does become more prominent in this story. It tried to be so extravagant in what the robots could do and how dangerous they were, but it didn't feel like it mattered at the end of the day. So it was a failure when it came to the science fiction part of things. Another thing I'll say, even though I'm not the most plot-driven reader, there was this apparent plot twist that happens towards the end of the story that didn't feel like a plot twist because it was so obvious. It was so highly telegraphed early on. So it didn't do much for me at all. While this book was such a flop for me, I will say that there were some signature Tanith Leap things in the book, some things that reminded me of Electric Forest of all things. Will I read another Tanith Lee book? Absolutely. I am eager to read more from Tanith Lee. Even though I didn't like this book at all, I still love her as a writer. That I am going to pick up actually Delirium's Mistress, I think is going to be the next Tanith Lee book I read, which is book 4 in Tales of a Flat Earth. So that's what all I'll say for this. Quite a disappointment, but still glad for the Silver Medal Lover. It didn't make me dislike the Silver Medal Lover. At least I could say that. So that's a positive. I would say if you read the Silver Medal Lover, please feel free to skip this one. I don't think it's needed at all. That is it for the books I read in the month of March. If I had to pick a favorite between Wolfe and Woolf, as those were the top books for me in the month of March, I would have to go with Wolfe. Which one? Okay, I think I would have to go with Urth of the New Sun. And that is kind of unfair given that this is book 5 in a series, whereas Mrs. Dalloway is a short, compact read. And they're both doing such different things, written in completely different styles, different genres. But I'm just taken with what Gene Wolfe accomplished in Urth of the New Sun and the series in general. Even though I do have my negatives, as I said, I do have negatives with this series. So that's where I stand for now. But let me know your thoughts if you've read any of these books or if you're planning to read any of these books. I know that these aren't necessarily the most widely recommendable kind of books, but I would love to hear from you in the comment section below, or let me know what you're reading. If you're still here, please let me know you're here by leaving a wolf emoji in the comment section below. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.